Oh, welcome in to the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, no cousin Shane on this episode. He needed the day off. But we got our good friend Steven Lassan, Athlon Sports, about to hop on the line to preview some of the upcoming matchups in the SEC. He's going to give us some thoughts on the big news there out of Nebraska, Scott Frost getting fired, and why that is relevant potentially for the SEC, some of the candidates being tossed around. We're going to mention that, as well as his thoughts on what in the world is going on there in College Station with Jimbo Fisher and how they can get that thing corrected. But before we get to that, got a couple news and notes around the SEC, and let's start right here with our buddy Paul Finebaum. Now, he was the latest guest at the Little Rock Touchdown Club. They're getting everybody down there at this Little Rock Touchdown Club. It's my mission in life to get I want cousin Shane as one of the guests. When we get that accomplished, we know we'll have made it based on they've had Coach O, John Gruden, now Paul Finebaum. They've had Bobby Petrie. I mean, the stars of stars on the Little Rock Touchdown Club. So the latest, Paul Finebaum talking about some of the most recent coaches there in Arkansas. This was fantastic.
State better. I mean, does he represent the state better than, let me think for a second, Chad Morris? And if I could go off the record, personally, I thought he was one of the biggest clowns I've ever met in my life. Off the record. Who was before him? Oh, by the way, I like Bielema. I thought he was a fun guy to hang out with, and I got to know both Brett and his wife, and closed many bars down with both. And then, who was before that?
John L. Smith.
John L. Smith. A bigger comedian I've never met. And
well, he went pretty hard in the paint, just about all of them, didn't he? But I don't know if anybody got it as bad as old Chad Morris. But I just thought that was too good not to share. And we also had Brian Kelly's got him some jokes here. Of course, last week he went pretty viral for the reporter calling him out, win a game, and I'll show up on time. Well, he turned right around. He was late for the press conference leading up to the Mississippi State game. So let's kick it over to Brian Kelly.
Here's my $10. So let's get that out of the way right away. I'll take a money order from the Advocate. I don't take a check because it might bounce. Oh, yours, it's personal. I thought it was a business expense.
At least he's having some fun with it. So you get to see Brian Kelly's sense of humor there. He's definitely a different cat. We saw this posted online. Some people loving it, some people hating it. It seems to be no middle ground with Brian Kelly. You either love him or you hate him. And regardless of where you lean on that, hey, he's going to have a good time with it. So I kind of appreciate the fact that he's letting this roll off his skin. But anyway, on with the show. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because we are in week 3 of the SEC season, but it's the time of the season where we're revealing kickoff times a week in advance. So the week 4 games, Saturday, September 24th, was revealed by the SEC here on Monday, and we got some good ones here. I just go in order of the kickoff times here. Missouri at Auburn. That's going to be a noon Eastern, 11 o'clock Central kickoff on ESPN. Going to follow game day. This could be a big, big matchup, obviously for both the teams, but for both coaches. Drake needs a win pretty bad. Brian Harsin, he may really need a win depending on what happens this weekend against Penn State. That is one to have your eye on for sure. Bowling Green at Mississippi State, SEC Network game, noon Eastern, 11 o'clock Central on the SEC Network. That's going to be one to watch. Kent State at Georgia, another noon Eastern, 11 o'clock Central. This one's on ESPN and SEC Network Plus. Now here, this is the number 1 game of the week. It's looking like in the SEC. Florida at Tennessee, SEC on CBS, game of the week, nationally televised, of course, 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central. So many storylines. We'll have to see hopefully both these teams cruise this weekend to set up a 3-0 Tennessee, I guess a 2-1 Florida Gators. This was annually the CBS game for years and years and years. Lost some luster in recent seasons, but hopefully this game is going to get some of its juice back starting here with Josh Heupel and Billy Napier going head-to-head. 4 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Central, we got Tulsa at Ole Miss. Ooh, another cupcake there for them Rebels. They've been filling up on them this season. Now here's the second game I'm most looking forward to in the SEC Week 4. Arkansas, Texas A&M, of course, in Arlington. 7 o'clock Eastern, 6 Central on ESPN, nationally televised. Who knows? A&M may be down in the dumps right now. You come around and you whip Miami at home. All of a sudden, this game, they already had it circled based on what happened last year, but this could be the game where Texas A&M figures things out, rights the ship, has all the momentum in the world, where they right the ship going into conference play. This is a big-time matchup for both teams. Of course, Arkansas, you can't look ahead. Texas A&M, you can make the case they're more talented than you are. Talent is not showing here lately, but critical matchup in the SEC. Arkansas, A&M, nationally televised ESPN. Also at 7 o'clock Eastern, 6 Central, Northern Illinois at Kentucky on ESPN2. Kentucky getting some mad respect. Normally this would be an SEC network type ball game. Maybe even a pluser. Hell, Kentucky's in the top 10. You can't not have them nationally televised in these games. So that should be a good one. We'll find out a lot more about Northern Illinois this weekend when they host Vanderbilt. That's pretty interesting. Back-to-back SEC games for Northern Illinois. Vanderbilt at Alabama, 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central on the SEC Network. Charlotte at South Carolina, 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central on ESPNU. And then last but not least, looks like we can barely make out this helmet, New Mexico at LSU, 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central on the SEC Network and ESPN Plus. So that's your Week 4 kickoff times and broadcast information. Now, last little bit here before we get to our interview with Stephen Lassan. Some great news. Kentucky getting back Chris Rodriguez. This is official. Not this weekend, but for the Ole Miss game, October 1st. That's going to be a big road trip for Kentucky. They just went on the road, obviously, at Florida. Can they keep that going at Ole Miss? We still don't know what the hell to make of Ole Miss. We'll find out a little bit more this weekend when they travel to Georgia Tech. But this could be a battle of undefeateds. It should be, as long as both teams take care of business. So very interesting matchup here on October 1. South Carolina. Now, here's the bad news. Hate to say it, but linebacker Mo Kaba, Jordan Strahan, the defensive end, both out for the season. That is official from South Carolina. They announced it here on Monday. Just wanted to give that little update. But okay, enough of me spieling by myself here. Let's kick it over to our interview with Stephen Lassan. Hey, we're pleased to once again be joined by the man himself, the college football encyclopedia, I like to call him, Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports. Give him a follow at Athlon Stephen and check out his outstanding YouTube channel. Stephen, thanks for joining us once again. And what is the YouTube channel that fans need to be checking out?
Hey, Mike. Yeah, thanks again for having me on every week. It's good to talk to you. And first of all, what a great college football season we've had so far. Week 1 and week 2 have lived up to it. All CFB 365 is the YouTube channel. We've got kind of weekly content. We got some big picture content up there. So I would appreciate if anybody would subscribe. And shameless plug, come by our Twitter Spaces on Monday morning and talk some college football with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to join it weekly there. It's always a good time hanging out with Stephen and Braden Gall, also at Athlon Sports, of course. Everybody should know who that is. But Stephen, we're here to talk some SEC football. That's why you're here. But hot topic right now. Also wanted to pick your brain a little bit. I know you're doing a deep dive on this because we've already got a coaching change. Buyout deadline be damned. Nebraska said get out, told Scott Frost. Thoughts on such a big job coming to open just weeks into the start of the season?
I'm surprised. I think, first of all, with the buyout dropping once you got to October, I figured Frost would probably be safe for a few more weeks, even though Nebraska just played so poorly on Saturday against Georgia Southern. But, this is a top 25 job in college football. And I think that's what makes it interesting. It makes it interesting, too, because of where Nebraska was and kind of where they are now in the food chain of college football. So I would be very interested with last season's coaching carousel being so crazy, and now we have Nebraska open. Like, what does it mean for this year? But Nebraska, I think, certainly is going to have a lot of high profile candidates that get mentioned for sure. We'll see if any of them actually take the job.
Now, of course, any conversation we have on here, Stephen, I'm going to steer it towards the SEC. And the whole reason I bring up Scott Frost, any candidates in the SEC that, it may be too early to say a realistic candidate, but maybe just someone that you think Nebraska will pursue. What's your thoughts on that when it comes to SEC coaches?
Yeah, I think if there's two candidates from the SEC so far that seem to be gathering mention on most coaching lists. I think the first one, we'll start with the easy one. We'll start with Bill O'Brien, the offensive coordinator at Alabama. I think at some point he's probably going to get another head coaching job if he wants one. And certainly this year, coordinating Alabama's offense, it's one of the best in college football. High profile track record of being a head coach. I don't think there's any doubt that his name will come up here and also down the road for others. The second one, and I bring it up later because I may need to put on a hazmat suit or wear a helmet for this one because I don't want anybody at Kentucky to get mad at me. I think Mark Stoops' name will come up here for sure. He was on my list of candidates, but I approach it this way. If I'm Nebraska, I want to talk to Mark Stoops. I don't know if he wants the job or will he take it. I want to talk to him because of the job that he's done at Kentucky. I mean, the first 3 years you could see was just program building. But since that time, I think he's 49 and 29, the 2 10-win seasons. What he's been able to do at Kentucky, and then you look at Nebraska, they haven't had a trouble recruiting. It's been the development aspect and everything else that goes with it. So someone like Mark Stoops is a program builder and can maximize talent would be, I think, an ideal candidate for Nebraska. I think I go back to what I said, which is I think there's a difference between candidates that get mentioned and ones that take the job.
Yeah, and I think that's just something that Kentucky fans are going to have to get used to, Stephen. I mean, they probably hate just seeing any mention of Stoops' name attached to any job. But given the fact that, Kentucky's a rising power, not only in the SEC, but in the country, that's kind of where you'd rather your coach be mentioned than have him be mentioned of if possible firing him. So, but let me ask you this, because I don't think Kentucky fans know this, I'm sure, and we've mentioned it many times on the podcast, but just a refresher maybe for fans that don't know, Mark Stoops has got, one of the best deals in college football. He's paid, I believe, in the top 20, if not top 15 of all programs in the country. If he wins 7 games, he gets an automatic 1-year extension. If he wins 10, which would be laughable when he got there, he gets automatic 2-year extension. And he's hitting that twice now in the last couple of years. So in my mind, I'm right there with you, Stephen. I think, it's two different things to say you want Mark Stoops. It's another for Mark Stoops to want Nebraska, because I think we have reached the point where Mark Stoops, he's only going to leave Kentucky, I think, for one reason, Stephen, if he gets to the point where he says, I cannot win a national championship here, and the school that is coveting me, I don't know who that would be, Alabama or Clemson, or I'm just naming schools here, but I think it would have to be a program that's proven you can win a national championship for Mark Stoops to leave. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think first, I'll go back to something you said just a few minutes ago, which is it's better to have your coach mentioned for high profile jobs than being mentioned as one on the hot seat. Like, you want your coach being mentioned as someone who could go potentially to one of the top 20 jobs in college football. But also, I think the second thing you said there is true, which is, not to litigate the offseason argument, Kentucky a basketball school or football school, or get into all that again. But I mean, if you are, Mark Stoops, the pressure at Kentucky compared to what we see at Nebraska, I mean, Scott Frost was it's his alma mater. He was a very successful quarterback there, and they're chanting "Fire Scott Frost" in the fourth quarter. So there's a difference between pressure and certainly there's a ton of pressure in the SEC, but you've got a great contract. You got a great situation if you're Mark Stoops. You built this program to this point. I don't really see there's not enough of a difference in salary or job status for Mark Stoops to make that jump. Now, if Kirby Smart retired at the end of 2022 and Georgia came calling, that's a little different story because of where Georgia or Alabama or Michigan or Ohio State is on the totem pole of college football. But I think it's a credit to Mark Stoops in the job that he's done that we would be talking about him for openings in college football.
Now, how about I got a couple candidates here, Steve. I just wanted to, I don't know if you'd even consider these guys, but and not hearing much buzz because I think I made it known publicly. I don't think much of Nebraska in the future of that program since they've joined the Big Ten. I think they really, they've set themselves up financially, but I think they've hurt the stability of that football program and the future of it. But I think they're going to have to get an assistant. Unless they're hiring maybe like a G5 coach or something. And there are some quality assistants in the SEC. What would you think about Barry Odom? Would he be a candidate that you would consider for Nebraska?
It's an interesting name. I think, first of all, I think Barry Odom will probably get some looks to be a head coach again in the near future, whether it's this year, whether it's next year. He much like Mark Stoops, has a great situation, though. I think there's nothing wrong with being the second, lieutenant on the staff, and you've got a great contract situation. You're working for a coach in Sam Pittman you really like. There's great culture, camaraderie at Arkansas. So I don't think there's necessarily any rush for him to leave. I would be surprised if he takes that job. I think he would be in that kind of second, third tier candidates that Nebraska would have to dip into. I think if you're looking nationally, there will be some guys who are P5 head coaches outside of Mark Stoops who will get mentioned here. So he would probably fall a little bit further down the list for me.
Now, one other name, Stephen, what about, no idea. I have no idea if this guy even wants to be a college head coach. He may be eyeing the NFL, but Georgia offensive coordinator Todd Monken, could you see him being someone that makes any kind of sense at all for a Nebraska type job?
Yeah, I think he is a coach who will definitely, in the future, if he wants to be a college head coach again, I think he should get some looks. I mean, he had a great tenure at Southern Miss. They were not very good when he got there. Completely different team when he left. He's been a successful offensive coordinator, of course, now with Georgia. So I think he's got the resume and the track record that you would look for at a P5 or G5 job. But also he's kind of in the same situation of Barry Odom. He doesn't necessarily need to leave. You're in a great situation at Georgia. You're going to be picked top 4, and especially with the expanded playoff coming, I mean, Georgia is going to be in it pretty frequently. So I don't know if Nebraska necessarily would be someone that goes after Monken, but I think some of those other kind of mid-tier Power 5 jobs down the road could be somewhere that potentially he gets involved in.
Now, I don't want to put this coach in the class of Scott Frost because we've already run him off. I'm not going anywhere near that for Jimbo Fisher, Stephen. But what are your thoughts? Obviously, the upset of the season so far, Appalachian State goes into College Station and knocks off the Aggies, and honestly, Shane, I mean, they deserve to win that football game the way they played and as poorly as A&M played. Do you think this season can be salvaged? And we talked about it on the last episode, on deck for A&M, Miami, Arkansas, Mississippi State, Alabama. I mean, arguably 4 of the top 20 teams in the country. This could go bad in a hurry. What's your thoughts on the situation?
Yeah, I think the panic meter probably should be pretty high on offense right now. And I think it's sort of the same thing that happened to Jimbo Fisher at Florida State, which is he hired kind of uninspiring assistant coaches. Steve Adazio so far, I think, has been pretty underwhelming as the offensive line coach. And then you also see that the quarterback position just hasn't developed. It was the same thing that happened at Florida State. Offensive line kind of went in the wrong direction. Quarterback play did at the end of his tenure. There's been, of course, he was asked this week about whether or not he would give up play calling. I don't know that that's necessarily the problem. I think the problem is more of scheme. And when you're talking about you've run the fewest plays of any team in college football, some of that was App State playing ball control. But this is an ongoing thing for A&M. It's pace, it's tempo. I think they need a little bit of evolution on offense. I think they need, when you watch Tennessee and you watch Texas A&M play offense, I mean, they're just two totally different things. So every position right now, when you look at A&M, to me, it all goes back to the offensive line. They have struggled there this year. If Bryce Foster may come back this week, if they can start to get that offensive line going, then they can get A-Chain going, and some things change for the offense. But, quarterback play has been inconsistent. And I just think as a whole, the scheme for Fisher and A&M just needs an update and a refresh. They need to be a lot more innovative on offense going forward.
Yeah, and of course, we have you on here, Stephen, to provide insight on these non-conference matchups, and that is one of the the biggest profile games in the country, or at least it was before A&M lost. Miami coming to College Station. What could you tell us about the Miami Hurricanes, and what's the threat level here that they knock off A&M?
I think first of all, Miami was picked by most people, I think, to win the Coastal Division this year in the ACC. So they are a dangerous team. We just don't know a lot about them so far. I mean, they beat Bethune-Cookman. They beat Southern Miss. They were supposed to win both those games, and they won easily. If you're looking at strengths, it starts at quarterback. Tyler Van Dyke is one of the ACC's best. Since the end of last year, he stepped into the starting lineup once De'Aaron King got hurt. Those last 6 or 7 games that he started, he was on a tear. And of course, they hired Mario Cristobal. They have sort of a new approach overall as a team. I think they are a much improved team, top to bottom. They brought in transfers on defense to alleviate and improve that group, which was really the question last year for Miami. Tackling was a huge issue. They were one of the worst in the country at missing tackles. Cleaning up that so far they've been off to a good start on defense. But again, the opponents have not been very good. So I think that's the question here is, you have a very dangerous Miami team with a good quarterback coming to College Station. You have an A&M team that should be pretty desperate, and a Miami team that's something to prove. It really sets up for a fascinating matchup. And frankly, Mike, I don't know about you, but I'm having a hard time getting a read on this game going into Saturday.
Yeah, and maybe maybe there's certainly cause for concern, but maybe a little overreaction because A&M is so young. They played so many freshmen in that opener. What are the chances, Stephen, that maybe A&M's not nearly as bad as they showed on Saturday, but just inconsistent is kind of what we're going to get, and maybe a lot of those players make big time plays on Saturday. And I certainly wouldn't think you're writing off A&M's chances to win this ball game, even though you're not ready to pick it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think first of all, if I'm Texas A&M, I'm banking on saying, hey, we're not giving up that much on defense. I know App State had, controlled the ball and they won, but this Texas A&M defense is still very good. It's near the top of the SEC in statistical categories. So if you're A&M, you're banking on, hey, the defense shows up. Miami's offensive line, which they're likely to get back Zion Nelson, who's one of their standout offensive linemen at left tackle. He's played a little bit. He's been banged up. Getting him back would be huge for Miami. They also have Henry Parrish, the Ole Miss transfer, at running back. So I think if you're A&M, the hope is your defensive line kind of takes control of this game. Miami doesn't really have a deep group of receivers. They're pretty strong at tight end. So I think maybe the play here is sort of a lower scoring game and sort of that desperation on offense. They just do enough to win this game. So I certainly am not going to write off A&M. I think this is a very winnable game for them.
Now, Stephen, I don't want you to have to do a deep dive on old Youngstown State here because, oh my God, I mean, they're facing, I think it's, I could be wrong, but I think Mark Stoops, maybe he's got some family that went there or his dad coached there or something. So he may go easy on old Youngstown, but instead of breaking them down, I thought it would be more interesting to hear your thoughts on Kentucky, what you have learned, maybe some questions you had going into the season that you think you have nailed after the 2-0 start from the Kentucky Wildcats.
I think Kentucky is starting to round into form. And I think we saw this in that second half against Florida. The rushing attack, while the production wasn't great, they did just enough to move the ball and kind of control the game. And then I think you're also seeing some of those young weapons at receiver, with Barry and Brown and Key and Tavion Robinson. The fact that Kentucky did not look great in week 1 at running the ball, I think they made a jump to week 2. Now now you can look forward and think, well, okay, well, now if they get those receivers and Will Levis has time to continue to acclimate to all those new pieces, I think Kentucky's going to be in good shape the rest of the way. And defensively, I was impressed with the way they played Anthony Richardson on Saturday night. They completely shut down the running game. They didn't give up much in the passing game either. And they made those critical stops, the returning the pick six for a touchdown, getting the other interception, a defense that we came into the year wondering about the defensive line and the secondary for Kentucky. So I think Kentucky, that was a huge win on Saturday night. And I think the message ought to be for Kentucky, hey, we can only get better from here.
Right, and with the news today, Chris Rodriguez, he's coming back for the Ole Miss game. That will be a massive pickup. I mean, I know Cavassier Smoke had a decent game against Florida, but he's certainly no Chris Rodriguez. And I think the most impressive thing you hit on at the defense there, they basically said leading up to this game, we're going to corral Anthony Richardson, make him beat us from the pocket. They basically gave the playbook and they went out there and executed it. So this is not only a talented team, but a confident team and borderline cocky. And I think that's how you have to have your defense if it's going to be successful in the SEC.
Absolutely. And you also touched on Chris Rodriguez there, which I think is huge. I mean, they're going to have him back basically for the heart of SEC play. And they just knocked off Florida, which was probably one of the tougher games, at least that they on paper, when you're looking at the SEC East and trying to figure out who can get to second. I mean, going into the Swamp and winning that game is huge without one of your best offensive weapons. So to me, I've got Kentucky right on the border of being a top 10 team. I think I had them at number 10 this week in my rankings, and I think well deserved and the potential to climb higher because I think the dominoes are starting to fall into place for this team.
Now, Missouri, they're playing Abilene Christian. Again, I'm not going to ask you to break down old Abilene, but Missouri, this should be a big bounce back week. Stephen, you tried to warn us last week. Kansas State is a legitimate team. We didn't want to believe it, Stephen. We were drinking the drink Kool-Aid on this show. We both picked Missouri to pull the road upset. I mean, it was the only thing upsetting was watching Missouri on offense there. So I don't know. What's your takeaway after 2 games of watching Missouri play?
I think a couple things stand out to me. I think the first thing is, like, if I'm Missouri, we got to find more ways to give Luther Burden the ball. I think he had 2 offensive touchdowns against Kansas State. I think he probably needs 10 to 15 touches offensively. He's just so explosive, and he's just it's cliche to say it, but like it's different to watch him and you watch some of the other players. Like he's just different in a good way and so explosive that you have to find more ways to get the ball in his hands. The other thing is we came into the season wondering about quarterback play and defense. And I think the jury is probably still out on both of those. I think it's good to see Brady Cook using his legs, moving around, making plays on the ground. But I also think that they're going to need more out of the passing game going forward, and especially in big plays. I mean, they haven't hit any big plays downfield, and that's going to be something that Missouri is going to have to figure out before they get really into the heart of SEC play.
Yeah, and Stephen, I mean, it's so early. I mean, this is what we do as college football fanatics. We freak out, fire this guy. Staff changes need to be made because of one loss. I know it was an ugly loss, no doubt. But heck, who knows? Kansas State, they may be a top 20 team for all we know. It's so early in the season. We may look back and say that was, one of the toughest teams Missouri plays. I don't know. But I made the argument, Stephen, that Missouri – and I'm not trying to be disrespectful when I say this, but I don't think that's a program, and I don't think many are, Stephen, that you can come in here and just fire the coach every 3 years and say, maybe we'll get it right this time. And the perfect example I used was Mark Stoops, because about 3 years into his tenure, many people were ready to run his ass off in Lexington. He needed, if you go back and he had to beat Mississippi State. He couldn't get over Dan Mullen and Mississippi State. They needed a game-winning field goal to beat Mississippi State. I think he was 0-3, 0-4, something like that against Mississippi State. They decided to keep him. And of course, that was the best thing that football program's ever done. Could the same be said? And again, we're not sitting here saying Drink is, the best coach in the SEC or anything, but I just think at Missouri, you got to invest in a guy that is bringing talent in to the caliber that he is.
Absolutely. I think a little patience is needed here. I think at some point, if you're Missouri and you're Drinkowitz, you're your potential has to turn into production at some point. You can't just live off of potential and promises. You have to actually turn that into wins and start showing it on the field. Proof of concept, essentially. You're selling something kind of new at this point, but at some point it has to turn into W's. And there have been some good things that have gone on. I mean, they went to a bowl game last year, and of course 2020 was weird, but they came into the season, I think, from expectation standpoint, I thought this was a 5 or 6 win team. And they got better last year on defense after that, terrible start. So I think if I'm Missouri, maybe the optimism is just a quarterback who's got less than 5 starts under his belt, a defense that has a lot of transfers. Maybe this gets better over the course of the season. But I think a little patience is needed here by Missouri for sure. If they could get the right quarterback, then I think we're talking about a much different team going forward.
Now we got red hot Arkansas, Stephen hosting Missouri State. Let's see if old Bobby Petrino pulls up in his motorcycle to Razorback Stadium here. But what's your takeaway from Arkansas, which is, they haven't beat, a top 5 or 10 team or anything like that to this point in time, but they have faced 2 very good opponents, in my opinion, and they've controlled both of them for much of the game. And that South Carolina game, I mean, they couldn't even slow down Arkansas a bit. What's your thoughts on the Razorbacks after watching them twice?
I've been really impressed with Arkansas. I've got them as a top 10 team going into week 3. It starts at the quarterback position. I mean, KJ Jefferson's just having such a good start to this year. I want to see more playmakers around him in that big play passing game. I think pretty obvious they missed Treylon Burks, but they've offset that by being really good at running the ball. And of course, Rocket Sanders has been, off to a great start too. The line of scrimmage in favor of Arkansas. And I think to your point, they've beaten Cincinnati, they've beaten South Carolina. I think South Carolina is probably a 6-6, 7-5 type team. Cincinnati's probably in the top 25 to 35 of college football. So they've been battle tested 2 times. They've passed the test both times. So I think it's just going back to what we talked about, a top 10 team with a difference maker, a quarterback. And I think the potential to get better as the season goes along, if they can develop the receivers and playmakers around him. And also, I love the fact that, this coaching staff does a great job of bringing in guys from the portal, and they're playing and they're making an impact right away. We've seen this both weeks of the season, Drew Sanders in week 2 and some of the other guys in week 1 on defense. So really, I think all the pieces are just falling into place for Arkansas right now this season.
Yeah, and there may not be a better program, Stephen, that stands to benefit if A&M does crumble than Arkansas, because that was the team a lot of people had projected over Arkansas in the preseason. And Alabama, again, let's not overreact to one game, but they didn't look like Avengers against Texas. So maybe they're not quite as good as they're cracked up to be. Does that at least clear the path to where, you'd have to be pretty diehard Arkansas homer to pick them to win the West during the preseason? But at least does it seem like somewhat of a possibility that Arkansas, if they play their A game against Alabama and they take care of business, I'm not saying they're going to go undefeated and win the national championship, not yet anyway, but do you give them an outside shot of at least knocking off Alabama now that we've seen the 2 teams play 2 games?
I think if you're Arkansas, don't you feel better about your chances against Alabama? I mean, I don't want to overreact and say that the dynasty is over in Tuscaloosa and, all that, craziness that we've seen over the past couple of years when Alabama loses a game. But I think Alabama, there are the question marks still. I think the receiving core going forward, offensive line. Also, look at the road games for Alabama last year. They lost at A&M. They didn't play well at Auburn. They didn't play well at Florida. Mississippi State's the one exception. So a kind of fired up road crowd in Fayetteville with an undefeated Arkansas against undefeated Alabama would be an amazing atmosphere in the SEC. I also think there is a little bit of caution here because the cyborg machine that is Alabama, the one close game that they have every year, and we see what happens, and then they can only get better from here. So there is some caution, but I think if you're Arkansas, you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself, but I think, don't you feel a little bit better about the way you've played and the way that Alabama looked this year, at least?
Right. Yeah. And speaking of Alabama, to me, they're like the Terminator, Stephen, where you think it's dead but it just keeps coming for you. And to your point, hey, road tests, LSU, we still don't know what to make of LSU, but we both anticipate they're going to be better as the season goes along. At Ole Miss, still, it's hard to tell what to make of Ole Miss, but they have surprised Alabama before. Obviously Arkansas, we just mentioned it. At Tennessee, I mean, there's some major tests still to come for Alabama, and of course the gauntlet of the SEC West. So anything that Texas potentially exposed, aside from, you already referenced the offensive line and the receivers, but I don't know how accurate the Fox crew was, but I assume they got this information after talking to the coaches. But it sounds like old Gary Patterson spent the entire offseason studying how to stop Alabama. Did he crack the code or anything that you think is going to cause Alabama problems the rest of the season?
It's a good question. I think probably the bad answer is, I think, to be determined, because I think Alabama is a work in progress on offense. I don't necessarily think that talent is an issue at both spots. Offensive line and receiving core, they have talent. They have options. I think it's just a matter of figuring things out. And of course, it's really hard to beat Alabama when you have Bryce Young. We saw this on Saturday, that every time Alabama needed a play, he came through and delivered. So that's, to your point, they are like the Terminators. Like, once you have them down, you need to sack Bryce Young. You need to make a play on fourth down. They just find ways to do it. And I think you'll see guys like Tyler Harrell, the speedster from Louisville, when he gets healthy. JoJo Earl was coming back soon. Also Kobe Prentice and Trayshawn Hold. They can only get better on offense. And so I think they will continue to improve, but I think offensive line and receiving core are my two concerns that I entered the year with. Still have concerns. I don't have many concerns about the defense, although it's really hard to gauge where they are, because when Quinn Ewers was in there, they gave up 2 scoring drives, and after that, Texas just wasn't the same offensively.
Yeah. Oh, what's your thoughts on Tennessee after 2 weeks? They almost gave that Pitt game away, or they tried to really hard, but I don't care how ugly it was, Stephen. They went on the road against a ranked opponent that they couldn't beat last season, and they did it. Not only the miscues, but a lot of penalties. They had to keep responding to the challenge. They got it done. And what's your thoughts on Tennessee after 2 games?
I think the best news for Tennessee is they are where they're supposed to be. They were favored to beat Pittsburgh. They favored to beat Ball State, of course. They took care of business. And I thought on Saturday, they fell behind early, and it felt like Pitt was on the verge of like pulling away, but Tennessee just kept hanging in there, punch back, got the turnover in the end zone. And then after that, I think once Tennessee settled in, they were fine. And I think optimistically, if you're Tennessee, Brew McCoy is starting to come on. Jalen Hyatt had a great game. The weapons around Cedric Tillman will help him going forward, so defenses can't focus so much on him. And of course, I think it helps a lot when you have Hendon Hooker at quarterback, because he's the perfect operator for that offense. So I think Tennessee, so far so good. I think you want to see continued development on defense and offensive line going forward. When they play Alabama, when they play Kentucky, when they play Florida, like, those are the groups we're going to be watching. But I think going up to Pitt and getting that victory was really huge for this team.
And never in my life, Stephen, have I seen Tennessee favored by 50 points in a ball game, but that was the opening line. I think it's come down to about 48, so we're giving Akron a little bit more credit, I guess. But, what's up with that line? I mean, is Akron that horrible? They could really lose by 8 touchdowns?
Akron, so first of all, their head coach is Joe Moorhead. So Mississippi State fans.
Oh, man, I had no idea.
Yeah, Joe Moorhead is their head coach. They brought in a lot of Power 5 transfers this offseason. They did lose their starting quarterback against Michigan State last week, so I'm not sure if DJ Irons, his status is a little bit up in the air. If he can't go, Jeff Undercuffler, all-name teamer, he will start at quarterback. He's a transfer from Albany. They lost 52-0 to Michigan State last week. So I think if you're Tennessee, I don't think you'll be under a lot of stress here. But I think in terms of just looking ahead, it's one of those games where Tennessee just needs to take care of business, keep everyone healthy, because on paper, Akron should not win this game. And frankly, they're probably worse than Ball State.
Yeah, Joe Moorhead, I know he's 0 for 1 in Neyland. He took Mississippi State in there with the which the Schrader, and man, it was Joe Moorhead versus Jeremy Pruitt in one of the ugliest SEC football games I've ever seen in my life, Stephen. But how about Vanderbilt?
Oh man,
Man, Vanderbilt.
yeah, no, I was gonna say, I think if you're Vanderbilt, I think optimism ought to be the word there. I mean, I know they lost to Wake Forest by 20 points, but I think there is improvement there. And I think the next question for this team is, can they get Mike Wright to play like he did against Hawaii and Elon in SEC play? I think that's the big question going forward. But if they can go up to Northern Illinois and get the victory and just get the 3 and then be more competitive in the SEC, there's no question they still have a ton to work on. And we'll figure out where Mike Wright is in his development going forward. But they look like a better team to me, I think.
Yeah, and I think when this line, I don't want to say debuted. I don't even know how they do it in the summer, Stephen, how much you can actually bet on these lines they put out. But I think Northern Illinois was like a 10 to 14 point favorite. When the lines open on Sunday, when you actually could bet on it, Vanderbilt was favored by 1, I think it was. I think that has flipped now to Northern Illinois by a point. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the prediction of the score. But do you anticipate this being a tight ball game? What can you tell us about Northern Illinois and how much danger Vanderbilt is if they don't play a good game that they could lose on the road here?
Yeah, Northern Illinois is dangerous. This is all they do. They play close games. I think 12 out of their last 16 games have been decided by one score. And what's also interesting is kind of the team evolution. They weren't very good in 2020 because they played a lot of young players. They added Rocky Lombardi, the former quarterback from Michigan State, and they won the MAC last year. It was one of the biggest surprises and turnarounds in college football to win the MAC. And then this year, they were picked to win the MAC by us at Athlon Sports. The strengths of the team is the running backs. Brown and Whaley, their 2 running backs, are good players. They're very experienced on both sides of the ball. Same thing for the offensive line. They play a lot of close games. They've already lost their number 1 receiver for the year back in the summer due to an injury. They weren't very good last year on defense, and they allowed over 30 points to Tulsa on Saturday and 27 to Eastern Illinois in the opener. So I think Vanderbilt should have the opportunity to move the ball in this game. But I think beware of close games because this is what Northern Illinois does. They find a way to keep it close, and they've found a way to win a lot of these recently, including beating Georgia Tech last year.
Now we got South Florida traveling to Gainesville. Before you share insight on South Florida, thoughts on the Florida Gators, Stephen? 1-1, of course, spectacular week 1. Last week, very disappointing. I mean, is it oversimplistic to say this team is going to go as far as Anthony Richardson can take them?
I think that's spot on. I think we saw the difference in week 1 and week 2 and where Florida needs Anthony Richardson to be at this point. And certainly I don't think they can count on him to be rushing for 150 yards or whatever every week. They're going to need him to keep developing as a passer. Some of that is the receivers. I think there is a real question of how deep the receivers are. I think they need to get Trevor Etienne the ball more at running back. And also, if you're Florida, optimistically, I think the defense last week held up well against Kentucky. If you can get more of that, that'll take some of the pressure off of the offense. So I think Florida's trending in the right direction. They're just going to need more consistency, especially as a passer from Anthony Richardson going forward to have a chance to beat Tennessee in a few weeks and then try to get back to second in the SEC East behind Georgia.
Yeah, I'm glad you referenced the Gator defense, Stephen, because I think that's being completely overlooked in all this, Anthony Richardson hype or Anthony Richardson trashing. But, I mean, the Gators have just been pathetic in recent seasons on defense. And here they went, essentially toe for toe with a quarterback in Will Levis that a lot of people have as a high round draft pick. But the game was lost essentially, on a pick six and other turnovers by the Florida Gators. So the defense certainly is doing their part, and that cannot be overlooked, I don't think. And they may just keep getting better and better as they get acclimated to this system. But what can you tell us about South Florida? Is this still Willie Taggart coach team and in any danger that they knock off the Gators this weekend?
I think a pretty low threat to the Gators. Jeff Scott is their head coach right now. What's also
Gotcha.
interesting is Bob Shoop is their defensive coordinator. He's been around at Tennessee and some other stops. It's a backs against the wall kind of year for South Florida. They have not been very good the last couple of years. Jeff Scott's under pressure to win. They brought in a lot of transfers, including Jerry Bohannon at quarterback, was at Baylor last year. So they are a veteran team in terms of starts, and you add the transfers and you add the coordinator changes. I think there's definitely kind of an air of desperation a little bit. Like they need to win this year, and those guys are brought in to do so. If you look at their results this year, they beat Howard by over 20 points last week, but they got pummeled in the season opener by BYU. I mean, I was watching that game, and before I knew it, it was 38-0 BYU, and I'm like wondering what the heck's going on here. I think this is a very low threat in terms of an upset for Florida, but I do think it's one of those games if you're Florida, because of the desperation out of South Florida. There's also not necessarily a rivalry, but there's a lot of players at South Florida who wanted to play at Florida. You certainly have to take it seriously if you're the Gators.
Man, what a throwback weekend. We got Moorhead, we got Shoop. I'm interested to see who else we got here. Oh, we got Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. He's got some SEC ties. Thoughts on it's hard to get a read on Ole Miss because they've played essentially two cupcakes. They've basically cruised in both of them. But what's your thoughts so far on a 2-0 Ole Miss team?
Yeah, I think similar to Arkansas, I think we've seen the transfers come through. Zach Evans and a couple guys on defense have really delivered for Ole Miss. But I also think, to your point, they've been probably the hardest team for me to figure out after 2 weeks because we just don't know. They played two games they were favored in. They took care of business. They didn't necessarily cover against Troy, but I think we'll find out a better idea of where they are this week and then going forward. But quarterback play is the one thing that I'm still wondering about. I think from watching both of the games for Ole Miss this season, I think it's pretty clear the upside is with Jackson Dart. He gives you more mobility, the big play potential, and also just the overall upside. So I think there's potential to get better here over the course of the season, but I also think there's just a ton of mystery after the first 2 weeks too.
And what can you tell us about Jeff Collins, his team there at Georgia Tech? I know he's been there a number of years. They've not really gotten it done, but of course it's basically like a 180 turnaround going from the triple option to what they're doing now. But I caught a little bit of that opener against Clemson, and it was rough to watch that offense. Have they improved at all, or what's the strengths and weaknesses of Georgia Tech?
I mentioned desperation for South Florida. There's a lot of desperation for Georgia Tech because Jeff Collins is under a lot of pressure to win this year. I mean, their schedule is really brutal. They still have to play Georgia later this season. They still have to play their ACC schedule. He's in real hot seat territory. In terms of their team, they've brought in a lot of transfers over the last 2 years, and I think you're going to see a lot of those guys start this year. But really, it all comes down to Jeff Sims at quarterback. He's talented. He's mobile. He's got a good arm, been inconsistent, has made some turnovers. I think, you mentioned the opener against Clemson. I think you saw an improved quarterback in that game. I think the question is, it was a lot of short throws, kind of a controlled passing game, because they couldn't really protect Sims from that Clemson defensive front. They had just 4 returning starters this year due to attrition and players leaving the program. So there's definitely desperation here for Georgia Tech. We also, they lost to Clemson. They beat an FCS opponent last week. So they're kind of hard to gauge, but they were one of the lowest rated Power 5 teams coming into the season.
So, based on all that, I would assume it's probably the threat of them knocking off Ole Miss is pretty low in your book. And I would include into that, they don't have much of a home field environment, is my understanding, even though this game is going to be on the road. Ole Miss is going to play in a lot more tougher environments than they're going to face this weekend, right?
Absolutely. I think the question here is what we were just getting at, which is the mystery of Ole Miss. Like, do they go on the road and does something go wrong? Does the quarterback play just not pan out? Because you are going to get a desperate Georgia Tech team because of where they are. And Jeff Sims, from a defensive standpoint, if he's on from the air and he's making plays on the ground, it could be pretty frustrating to defend. But he has just been, his inconsistency combined with the offensive line concerns, and then defensively, they come into the year with a lot of questions too. I mean, this is a game that Ole Miss is favored by double digits for a reason. So maybe a medium-sized red siren here for Ole Miss to make sure they take it seriously, but they're favored, I think, for a reason.
Now, what I would imagine, Stephen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably going to be the SEC's toughest victory to earn here. Penn State coming down to Auburn. Last week you told us how much of a rebuild it is there in San Jose, yet, man, they went, I don't want to say toe-to-toe with Auburn, but they had an opportunity had they made a play here or there to beat Auburn. Auburn was just awful in that game, I thought. What can you tell us about Penn State and how big of a threat they are to come into the SEC and come away with a win?
A big threat. I also think that there's got serious chaos potential with this game. Both of these teams. I mean, last year's game was great in Happy Valley. I also really don't know what to make of Auburn, to your point. Last week's performance was concerning. Week one's was a little better. Don't know what to make of the quarterbacks yet. They've thrown quite a few interceptions for just 2 games this year. I think we know the strength of this team is that offensive line and running game. Penn State, from a defensive standpoint this year, they have not faced a running team that's should be as good as what Auburn can be. Both Purdue and Ohio, from an offensive line, from a rushing standpoint, just don't do it as well as what Auburn should be able to on Saturday. And I think if we go back to last year, it was kind of about which team was better in the red zone, also which team got better quarterback play. And Sean Clifford was better last year for Penn State, but he can run very hot and cold. We saw this in the opener against Purdue. He threw a horrible interception by overshooting a receiver. He comes back and leads the team to the game-winning victory. So a lot of what Penn State is doing offensively really hinges on their offensive line. If it holds up, they can get a little bit going on the ground. They haven't been very effective there, but keep an eye on Nick Singleton. He's the true freshman running back. He was over 100 yards last week. It was their first 100-yard rusher in some time. I think since 2019 or 2020. They finally seem to have a big play threat at running back. They're deep at receiver, but it all hinges on that offensive line, how well they hold up against Auburn's defensive front.
Yeah, and this is, Stephen, this is the first SEC on CBS game, nationally televised, of the season. So like you said, it could get pretty wild down here. I can imagine one of these teams jumping out to a big lead and the other team finding a way to steal a victory. And, man, so who's under more pressure? I mean, I think James Franklin just signed a contract extension, so maybe pressure's not the right word, but what's his level of support up there? Because last time I checked, Penn State's not been good the last couple of seasons.
Yeah, they're right around 500 the last, I think, since the start of 2020. 2020 was just such a weird year. They had kind of a weird opener against Indiana, and then things kind of fell apart after that. Last season, they started 5-0, but they finished 2-6. A big part of that was injuries. Sean Clifford, their quarterback, got hurt against Iowa. They lost a couple players in that game. So there were some circumstances last season. But I think, to your point, I think we're seeing, like, Penn State's not closing that gap to Ohio State. Michigan won the Big Ten East last year. So I think there is some pressure for James Franklin to show that, hey, you're asking for all these resources, everything with facilities and NIL. 7-6 isn't good enough. So I definitely think that there's some pressure to show that this program is on the right track. And certainly for Brian Harsin, considering everything we know about Brian Harsin and Auburn going into this year.
It would be the most Auburn thing ever, Stephen. If everybody counts them out, they're going to get whooped at home. They turn around and do the whooping. So, hey, I'm not writing off Auburn just yet. But we do have a great matchup here, potentially, in the SEC West. Mississippi State at LSU. Let's focus on Mississippi State for a second. In my mind, Stephen, they're one of the best 25, 20 teams, maybe even 15. I mean, they've been red hot, loaded with experience. What's your thoughts on Mississippi State? How impressed have you been with them after 2 weeks?
Very impressed. And I think also, to your point, I think underrated nationally. They've played 2 quality opponents, a much improved Arizona team, and also Memphis, which should be a bowl team out of the American Athletic Conference, and won both games by double digits. I think that's a really good start for this Mississippi State team. I think there was some worry about going on the road and inconsistency based upon some of the things we've seen from Mississippi State in non-conference games under Mike Leach, but they took care of business in a pretty convincing way. Will Rogers is off to a great start, completing almost 80% of his passes. The depth at receiver and running back weapons looks good again. I think defensively, you go back to the game on Saturday, they gave up a touchdown drive on the first series of the game. Not surprising because Arizona, with the game script comes out, they have a good drive. But after that, the other two scoring drives that Arizona had were off of short field situations. So really, I think this defense for Mississippi State is very underrated. We'll find out a little bit more about them this week when they play LSU, but I think Mississippi State, one of the most underrated and undervalued teams after 2 weeks.
Now LSU, of course, lost in the opener, but they played awful for about 3 quarters, and then I don't want to say caught fire in the fourth, but hey, nearly stole one, and then they turned right around, and there's not much to take away from beating Southern, but they suffocated them. What's your thoughts on LSU coming into this matchup? How big is this game loom on their schedule?
It's huge. I think we're going to find out a better idea of where LSU is at this point, because I've always thought that LSU would start slow and build momentum throughout the year. They would be a much improved team over the course of the season. And of course, from a personnel standpoint, they shuffled the offensive line last week. John Emery should be back at running back. I'm curious to see if the offensive line and running game continue to improve. We'll have a better idea once they play Mississippi State this weekend. And then too, Jaden Daniels, does he make that step forward and continue to build on that second half against Florida State? It's so hard to read into anything in last week's game. So I'm looking forward to seeing just offensive development. And then defensively, the secondary with all those transfers was a question mark coming into the year. Not a great debut against Florida State. And of course, they're going to get tested probably 50 times by Mississippi State on Saturday.
Yeah, we're recording this on Monday evening, Steven, so I'm not going to sit here and ask you to pick that game, but is there maybe one way you're leaning? Do you think this will be a really tight ball game? Could you see one of these teams blowing the other one out? I don't know. What's your early thoughts on this matchup?
I'm going to give you a very bad answer, and I'm going to tell you I like a close game. I mean, the first of all, the last two games between these two teams have been, weird. I mean, we had the 2020 game where Mike Leach and KJ Costello come into Death Valley, throw the ball all around, score the upset win. And then last year, of course, it was a 3-point game. It felt like LSU was more in control of that game than just 3 points. But I like the way Mississippi State is playing. I think LSU will be improved from game 1 to game 3. So I hate to give you a bad answer, but I think it will be a close game. And I think if you're LSU, Ojulari needs to be healthy, especially without Mason Smith, because if you don't have him and you're going up against Will Rogers and he has all day to throw, that's a tough matchup for that LSU secondary for sure.
And what's your level of concern, though, that Mississippi State veteran receivers, they're firing on all cylinders, and then LSU, they got loads of talent, but it's kind of like all new pieces and all new system playing together. That could be a mismatch that favors Mississippi State. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be. What's any level of concern there?
Yeah, I think for Mississippi State, my biggest concern on offense coming into the year was the offensive line. And I think this LSU front, even without Mason Smith, I think it's still one that could give Mississippi State a lot of problems, especially with just the athleticism and the depth and the rushers that they have. If Ojulari's back to 100% and playing this week, that's good news for LSU. So I think one of the ways that, I think you can slow down Mississippi State is, number one, pass rush, but you can also kind of slow them down by using a lot of, like we've seen what Arkansas and some of these other teams do. You can load the field with more defensive backs and just keep everything in front of you. So if I'm LSU, I'm worried about how this secondary faces, especially with all the new pieces going up against a passing attack that, with all those new pieces, they haven't played together at LSU. How does that mix? But also, I think if you're Mississippi State, you're looking to see how your offensive line holds up against LSU, because Memphis and Arizona are definitely not in the same, kind of class as pass rush defensive end talent that LSU has.
Now, the final game on the slate here in the SEC, another conference matchup. Number 1 Georgia on the road at South Carolina. A little bit of buzz off this game after South Carolina lost to Arkansas, but this will be an opportunity for the Gamecocks to shock the world, right that ship. But let's focus on Georgia for a second. I mean, I don't know what there is to be said about the Bulldogs at this point in time, but could you make the case, though, that maybe Oregon is just horribly overrated? Bo Nix made some bad mistakes, and then there was really nothing to learn from Samford, and that this could be and should be the toughest test that Georgia has to date on the season?
I think anytime you go on the road in the SEC, like that would worry me if I'm a coach, especially going into South Carolina, especially with the environment that we've seen. And South Carolina is going to be fired up for this one, being at home and being in the SEC. So I think there is some, I think, concern of just how do you play on the road in the SEC with all the new pieces that Georgia has. I think Kirby will be interested to see how it all meshes together. Mike, I think Georgia's on another planet, though. I mean, it's hard for me. I could sit here and try to make a scenario where South Carolina keeps it close because the offensive line plays markedly better than they have the first 2 weeks of the season. But I mean, it's just so tough. Georgia has an advantage: offensive line, defensive line. The way they dominated Oregon, I just think it's just so hard to see South Carolina keeping it close on Saturday.
Well, you got to keep this into consideration, Stephen. I'm the idiot that went on Finebaum in the summer and said South Carolina pulls this upset. So I already know that old takes exposed guy. He's already got the tweet pulled up, ready to go and everything. So at least give me something, some kind of silver lining that maybe that gives me hope that South Carolina could pull the upset of all upsets here. You got anything?
I'll give you something. Let's say Spencer Rattler has the game of his life. Let's just say that South Carolina holds up offensively, especially up front. And, Georgia's secondary, of course, has some really talented freshmen. Starks is playing great already to start the season. Maybe some of that youth in the secondary shows up. Rattler has a good game. They hit on a few big passing plays. That keeps it close into the fourth quarter, and the crowd and environment, and they find a way to steal one. I think for South Carolina, on defense too, they're going to need to get a couple of takeaways for sure. I think that's going to be one of those things with the way that Georgia played in the opener and the way they played last week. I mean, Stetson Bennett's on fire. The depth of talent at running back and receiver, this is going to be, it's a tough matchup. So I think win the turnover battle, protect Spencer Rattler, hit on a few big plays downfield, let that crowd that's going to be in Columbia get excited for 4 quarters and keep it close late into the second half. That would be my formula. And hey, what about some beamer ball too? A couple blocked punts.
Yeah, I was about to say it, Stephen. 3 blocked punts for touchdowns maybe needed to beat the Georgia Bulldogs, and maybe not even that's going to be good enough to do it. But Stephen, I can't thank you enough. All this outstanding information before you hop off the line. One more time, can you tell the audience where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. Athlonsports.com. We also have our weekly podcast, the Cover 2 podcast. We do a preview podcast posted on Thursdays. You can also come join us on our Twitter space on Mondays to recap the week. You can also check out my YouTube page, All CFB 365, trying to do some preview content, some big picture content. So if you like college football, check me out and subscribe, and look forward to hanging out again next week, Mike. Absolutely.
The Cover 2 podcast, Stephen, legitimately one of the can't miss podcasts out there. I've been listening for probably 10 years. So it's on my rotation. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I just will say thanks again, Stephen, for joining the show. I hope everybody appreciated that. He delivered the goods as he always does. But hey, that is going to do it for this latest episode of the show. Cousin Shane back on the next episode. We'll be breaking down some of the upcoming games this weekend. I know the schedule doesn't look like the best in the SEC, but I guarantee there's going to be some drama. And every time we look at the schedule and say, oh, it's kind of ho-hum, that's usually the best weekend of games we get. So many storylines across the SEC, some conference matchups. Who knows what the weekend is going to deliver, but we're going to be here all week breaking it down. leading up to kickoff. So stay with us. Appreciate each and every one of you for checking us out. We'll catch you on the next one.